My name is Myles Allen. I'm a professor of Geosystem Science in the Environmental Change Institute, University of Oxford, and I've just had the pleasure of talking to an American-European Business Association lunch on the topic of achieving net zero. So we talked about how important it is to reduce global carbon dioxide emissions to net zero to stop global warming. We have to do that to stop global warming. It helps to do various other things as well, but that's the one thing we absolutely have to do. And we talked mostly about how to do it, how in particular the fossil fuel industry could become part of the solution to climate change rather than being seen as the problem at the moment. A lot of the questions were around how could different companies get entrained into solving climate change rather than pushed into doing things that they might not be best equipped to do through the incentives imposed by governments. And so I think there's a real opportunity, particularly in the build up to the COP26 next year, for the private sector to get involved in reshaping the climate change agenda onto and getting it refocused onto net zero. To some extent, if you're going to talk about one thing, you've got to decide what are you not going to talk about instead. And one of the consequences of focusing on what it'll take to achieve net zero in 2050 is that may mean talking less about what it'll take to reduce emissions next year. But since we're in a situation where we've reduced emissions almost by mistake through COVID-19, this might actually be quite a good time to be having that long-term conversation and changing the subject almost from the immediate emissions outlook towards achieving full decarbonisation of all of the activities we're engaged in by 2050. And that's a conversation that I think companies actually really should be playing a very big role in, because the investments that are being made today that will determine whether or not we actually can achieve a net zero world by mid-century are being made by major companies around the world, as well as cities and governments as well. So it's redirecting that investment towards a net zero world that needs to be our priority. And just not only the companies making these investments, but those lending to those companies and those investing in those companies all have a very important role to play here. So that's the main message of my talk, was the importance of framing the conversation about decarbonizing everything we do, including our use of fossil fuels. And if you're puzzled by the notion of decarbonizing fossil fuels, what I mean is, if you burn, by mid-century, if you burn fossil fuels, and there will be activities that will still be economic in 2050, for which it will still make sense to burn fossil fuels, you will have to ensure that every ton of carbon dioxide generated by continued fossil fuel use is disposed of permanently out of the atmosphere and not just dumped in the atmosphere and left to affect the climate of future generations. That's what decarbonizing fossil fuels means. If we can do that by 2050, and I'm fully confident we can, then we have largely solved the climate problem.